fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren, and we're jumping right in with true crime today. And we've got a returning guest. She's got a new book, and it's called Down to the Bone. Okay? And it's Caitlin Rother. So thank you for being here, Caitlin.
Sure, thanks for having me back.
Well, Caitlin, this is quite a story about the missing family. Let's talk about that first of all. What's the basic storyline here of what happened?
It's kind of in a few different parts, so I'll just go through them one by one. This is first a mystery. It's a missing persons case. So this family of four basically vanished one day in the middle of breakfast because when Joseph McStay, his wife Summer, and their two little boys, Gianni and Joey Jr. So Gianni and Joey Jr. were 3 and 4 years old, so real small. They had just moved into this house, which they were remodeling. They bought it in foreclosure, and so they were completely redoing it. Joseph manufactured waterfalls, and he had an online business, and he worked with 2 primary business associates. One of them helped him manufacture the waterfalls, and one of them basically designed the website where they sold the waterfalls, but he wasn't really involved in the business that much anymore. So Joseph was trying to kind of sideline the web designer because a year earlier he had threatened to shut down the website if he didn't pay him off and all kinds of other issues. So he was, a younger guy. He had already kind of done his part, and Joseph wanted to move into, being his own man and having his IT in-house and not use this guy anymore, especially after he threatened him. So he was working with the other guy, who goes by Chase, as the nickname, Chase Merritt, and they were trying to expand the business, get more clients, build bigger waterfalls, not buy the prefabricated ones, which they didn't make as much money on. And so that was kind of where they were. And then this family just disappeared. So the last person who apparently had seen them was Chase over lunch the day before. No one saw them again. Chase got in touch with Joseph's mother, a few days later after not being able to reach him. Dan Cavanaugh, who's the web designer, he basically tried to get in touch with Joseph's stepfather, who he had met once before, years before. Basically, no one knew where they went. They weren't expecting them to just disappear like that because normally, he's running a business day to day in communication with these 2 business associates. So anyway, the sheriff's department were notified about 11 days later, and at first the detective who was taking charge of this case thought that there had been foul play, and that's what it said in the search warrant. But I guess the judge said, well, I need more, and I don't see, there was no blood. There was no sign of foul play that they found in the house. It's just that these people, vanished and they didn't know where they went. They left their dogs abandoned outside, no food and water. Summer left her prescription glasses. And, like I said, they just left in the middle of running a business, which was weird because they had some big projects pending. So for the next 3 or so years, this detective said, well, I can't get a search warrant, for anything more because the judge won't let me. And so I'm just going to, keep doing it as a missing persons case. And then he gave up. He says, well, I think these people went to Mexico. Just gave up. And then 8 months later, their skeletal remains were found in the desert. So they had not gone to Mexico. They had not gone voluntarily anywhere. Each of the skulls of these family members who were found in 2 shallow graves in the Mojave Desert, they all had holes in the back of their skull that looked to be the size of what a 3-pound sledgehammer had created, and the sledgehammer was found in one of the graves. So then it became a homicide case.
Now, this happened, I guess February 15th, 2010 is when they went missing.
Yeah, that was the day of the missing persons report, but they went missing February 4th, 5th, somewhere in there.
Isn't that crazy, because I remember when it kind of made news, and the news actually was suggesting that it was probably something drug-related initially.
Well, that's, I think, what the detective initially thought. Joseph had some ecstasy in the fridge. I guess he and his brother used to sell it when they were younger. But there wasn't any evidence of that. There wasn't, they didn't find any drugs. There wasn't any kind of evidence. But yeah, when it got to the point where they found the skeletal remains, somewhere along the line, it was mentioned by the defense after Chase was eventually arrested, that this looked like the work of a cartel that actually used sledgehammers to kill people, because it's pretty unusual for somebody to kill small children, and it's a pretty heinous crime in the world of criminals. They have their own hierarchy. They're the thieves, and they're at the very kind of at the top of the chain. They think that they're better than everybody else, and that they'll kill the pedophiles and they'll kill the child killers in prison because they don't see themselves as the same. They think of these other people as worse. So that's kind of how I look at it too. And I'm thinking, okay, Chase Merritt, who does have a criminal record, as did Dan Kavanaugh, and Dan Kavanaugh's record involved domestic violence, and Chase Merritt's criminal record involved theft. If you look at the two of them next to each other, they were the ones who I kind of have to focus on in the book, because they became Dan Kavanaugh became the defense's case. Like, it wasn't Chase Merritt. They should have been looking at Dan Kavanaugh. But anyway, Chase Merritt never hurt anybody. He never had any violent crimes. So you kind of have to wonder, why would a career thief or con man suddenly kill the two little boys of his best friend?
Yeah, and not only that, it's like you said, the killing of two children as well, right? How do you decide on what kind of a person would do that, right?
It takes a certain kind of person, I think, to kill two little kids. Even, clearly though, whoever did it from behind, because the holes in their skulls were in the back. Right. But you still kind of know what you're doing, right? So no. That's like, somebody has no conscience, no. Just nothing. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I can't imagine. I don't know that I've met anybody who,
No, even, I hope not.
Well, I have interviewed killers that I write books about, but I haven't interviewed Chase Merritt, and he is on death row for doing this, but I don't take a position on his guilt or innocence in the book, and I'm not going to do it now. So I'm just saying, Chase Merritt aside, I have not interviewed. I've interviewed killers who, Skylar DeLeon, I think we talked about him before. Yeah. She's now a she. She cut a guy's throat barehanded and left him to bleed at the roadside, and tied Tom and Jackie Hawks to an anchor and killed 3 people. And when I met with her in jail, I couldn't tell that she was a killer either. So that's the thing, sometimes people just present very differently, so you can't always know. Yeah, you don't always know, but it's just, I think the killing of children, something like that, it becomes a little bit more, you're one step further away. Absolutely. And I don't know. Well, so who were the family, in the sense of, like, what kind of life did they live? What kind of people were they? Were they fairly popular, good people, no issues in the community? Just a typical family, or was there something else going on? Well, they were kind of in the middle of a family crisis when this all happened. And so the detective was kind of focused on this, and they were interviewing other people right away because they thought maybe this was an impetus for them disappearing on their own. And that was, I have to be careful, though. I can't go into too much detail for privacy reasons, to protect people who are allegedly involved in this. And this is a CPS investigation that Summer filed a complaint about. And I don't want to go into details because of, like I said, I'm protecting people's privacy. But it separated and divided the whole family because it involved allegations about Joseph had a son from a previous marriage, and the stepfather who his Joseph's first wife, married, they were kind of all named in this thing, and it was just a whole mess. And so Summer was making accusations. Summer made these same accusations to CPS. So there was this whole investigation, and, there were therapy sessions, and, Summer didn't want her boys to be, anyway, there was separation and division at that point. So there were a lot of people upset with each other. There were accusations being thrown around. And so the detectives initially, were investigating and interviewing that other stepfather, who did have a criminal record, by the way, and violent behavior. So, but they cleared him pretty quickly. This is all in the book, but I can't go into too much detail about the CPS investigation itself. But anyway, they thought, that right around the same time as, they were in the middle of this whole thing. And so they thought, well, maybe they disappeared because of the CPS investigation, So and it turns out that, the Summers' claims were found to be unsubstantiated. So nobody was found to have done anything that she claimed, but they were already gone by that point. So, but based on the injuries that were found on these bodies, they didn't disappear and go to Mexico on their own. They were clearly taken out to the desert. Now, Summer was also blamed for isolating Joseph from his friends and the rest of his family. She got into a falling out with Joseph's brother. She got into fallings out and issues with her own family members as well. So she was kind of a lightning rod in all of this initially. And, I got the investigative reports from the sheriff's department way late in the process, like right 4 months before I had to turn my book in. I had to completely rewrite my entire book because I had been waiting to get this treasure trove of discovery materials. And it took me that long after working on this book for 12 years. I finally got them, but, I'd already written most of the book. I had to completely redo the whole thing. But this is how I found out all these details. So anyway, Summer, in the background had been going through all this stuff. She loved Joseph. Joseph loved her, but she was a feisty one. And, she was like I said, a lightning rod in the family. So Joseph's mother and she didn't really get along that well. She got along pretty well with Joseph's stepfather, who lived in Texas, Patrick McStay. One of the weird things was that, Joseph had been having this weird physical problem. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. He was getting vertigo and dizzy. And he told his mom, I had to pull over the side of the road, for a while, for months. In fact, he had to stop playing soccer. He just wasn't well, and they couldn't figure out why. They had been on some kind of FaceTime call with Patrick, and Summer and Joseph both said, we want you to take care of the boys if anything happens to us or to Joseph, which was weird because that was right before they disappeared. So it's still unclear if they knew about something else that was going on. And, if it was drug related, even though they didn't find any evidence of that, it's just like these unanswered questions that are still a mystery today.
Right. And the San Diego police. So what's the controversy there? What's the issue there? There seems to be a lot of, complaints and problems.
The issue was that the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, did not investigate this as a homicide, even though there were all these red flags, because they didn't find any blood in the house and because they couldn't find any specific signs of foul play. Once San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department took over the case as a homicide, I spoke with the lead detective, and he said, yeah, if we had been handling this, I would have tried again with a different judge, or try again with getting more search warrants, because, when they didn't show up after a certain point, they probably didn't just disappear, it's something bad happened to them, so that the criticism came because the sheriff's department in San Diego, did not do its job properly in many people's view. And I think we talked about my previous book, Death on Ocean Boulevard, which was the same sheriff's department. Again, lots of criticism that they didn't handle that case right either. Same homicide unit that handled mysterious deaths. And in this case, Rebecca Zahau, they ruled her death a suicide. Her family and a civil jury subsequently found that it was not a suicide, that it was a murder, and that the jury found Adam Shacknai, Rebecca's boyfriend's brother, responsible for her death. So she had according to the sheriff's department, she had hung herself naked, bound, and gagged from an outdoor courtyard at the Spreckles Mansion in Coronado. So I look at that as part one, and this book is part two. And the claims are the same and the criticisms are the same, that this was confirmation bias. Basically, that these investigators had an idea in their head and they just would not let go, even though it was flawed. And even, in this case, they turned out to be wrong. In the Rebecca Zahau case, they still can't prove either way what really happened, but the sheriff's department refuses to move from the suicide ruling. So they don't like to admit any mistakes. So which was odd in this case, when these bodies were found, they were still holding on to the premise that these people had still disappeared to Mexico, that was still possible, even though they found the remains with holes in the backs of their skulls. So that's where the criticism comes from.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy. So now the people that are suspected. So Chase Merritt, how did they come up with him as a suspect?
Well, he has a criminal record of theft. Okay, and he had an outstanding warrant even at the time of this disappearance of this family, where he was supposed to be serving the rest of a sentence that he had left as a parole violation, because he didn't keep up with the stuff that he was supposed to do. And anyway, he told the San Diego Sheriff's Department about this immediately. And that was that he had been working with Joseph to move the accounting system that they were keeping secret from Dan Kavanaugh, because Joseph didn't want to share any more money with him because he threatened him and tried to take the website down and destroy the business. So he was hiding things from Dan Kavanaugh. And we know this is true. And, Chase mentioned that. So he said, but he didn't mention Dan Kavanaugh initially. He said he was trying to keep it separate from Summer, which was also true. Apparently Summer had a whole spending thing that she was always buying toys and beach stuff and all kinds of stuff. Anyway, which was an issue because they didn't have that much money. And Joseph was like, well, that there's no more money in the account, just so that she wouldn't keep spending. So Chase basically said they were trying to take this accounting system and move it away from where Dan Kavanaugh could get it. And like I said, even though he didn't mention Dan Kavanaugh, it's the same premise that he was trying to do that. So basically he said that he was, needed to be paid for to keep these ongoing jobs, in process, because he just disappeared and he couldn't get a hold of him. And so he was trying to keep the business going and therefore was paying himself to keep working on these things. And basically, he ended up taking a total of about $20,000, some of which he used to pay another vendor that they were using in the manufacturing process. So at the same time, Dan Kavanaugh was also taking money, even before they vanished, by the way. He was sending out invoices to clients, which was not his job. Joseph always handled all that. So he was actually trying to get money for jobs. That's something he'd never done or been asked to do before, and trying to collect money even before they vanished. And then he changed the passwords in the PayPal account and started taking money from Joseph's account before that had even been reported missing. So It's sort of bizarre that both business associates are starting to take money, and both of them claim that they had permission to do that, right? So, but Chase Merritt is the one who got arrested for it. Dan Kavanaugh went on to take over the entire business, and by the time this all ended, he had taken $200,000 from the business and then sold it without authorization from the family.
Wow. How does that happen?
But he was never even considered a suspect. He was never arrested. He was never.
What's the difference? Like, why Merritt and not Kavanaugh? Like, what was, I don't.
That's what the whole defense's case was at trial. Exactly your question.
Well, was there any physical evidence, or anything to prove either one of them as possibly?
No. That's the thing. Well, okay, I can't say no, not exactly. There was no blood. There was no physical evidence tied to anyone, because they never found any blood in the house, not a single drop. And if you know anything about head injuries, if you got a hole in the back of your skull, there's going to be a lot of blood, and it's going to go everywhere. But they did not find a single drop of blood in the house. They didn't find a single drop of blood in Merritt's car, the truck. They actually tracked it down, and they did the whole thing with the Blue Star, the blood reagent that they try to flash a light and see if it's purple, right? They did that. You couldn't find any blood anywhere on any of his clothes. That they basically could not tie him forensically to the house at all, or to the truck, this murder. They did, however, find a trace amount of DNA on the steering wheel to one of the McStay's cars, which he said he never drove. And so they decided that Merritt had driven them someplace and taken the car to the border of Mexico in San Ysidro, and that's why his DNA was on the steering wheel. However, it was very minor amount, and the major contributor to the steering wheel, who according to the defense expert who testified, should have been Joseph McStay, the last person who had driven the car, who should be the major contributor. That was Joseph McStay. So that's the only physical evidence that they had, and the defense expert pretty much decimated that. But the jury still found him guilty, and it was because I guess they just, the emotional impact of just wanting to find somebody who was guilty of killing those two little boys. And the prosecutor had the sledgehammer in the courtroom, and he's pounding the podium with it, and it's that's all, it's just a very emotional thing, which the jury's supposed to not be emotional, right? They're not supposed to have sympathy for the family and, these little kids, but that's pretty impossible, right, to ask. But
so he gets convicted of this, as well as sentenced to death, even though I guess California's never really gone through with killing any other prisoners, but.
Well, they have. It's just we've had a moratorium for a long time. And I have to say, there was a lot more. There was cell phone tower evidence, which is pretty technical. There was also defense claims that there was DNA that was found on items that were in and around the grave that actually were foreign. So they did not belong to any of the McStay family, and they did not belong to Merritt. They belonged to other foreign people that they had not identified because they couldn't put it in through the CODIS system, the federal database system that has people's DNA in it. So that remains not untested because it was tested, but unmatched. They couldn't run it through the system to see if there was a match. So that's still hanging. And that's part of the reason that this just seemed like this was an unfair aspect of the case, that you would think that, why not just let them test that to see who that might have belonged to? Because it was found on items that were in and around the grave. And if it wasn't Merritt, then who was it?
Yeah. Well, what I'm having an issue with is, so this guy's got a gambling problem and, he's stolen some money, 20,000, whatever.
If he stole it.
If he did. But, either way, you kind of put all this together and you think, is that enough to make a guy go and kidnap a family
Exactly.
of 4, take them out, and then murder them himself,
Exactly.
not just hire someone.
Exactly.
He does it himself, bury them, all this stuff like that. It just seems awfully, it seems to be terrible wording, but overkill, Yeah, it's like, but it you know what I'm saying, just for that.
Yes, I do.
It doesn't
Yes.
match. And that's kind of just from outside looking at it, going, wow, this guy must be, to me, he would have to be a real loon, like one that just jumps off and was really violent or had no problems hurting people and stuff like that. And I don't know Merritt.
Right.
I've never met him, or really, I don't know him.
Right.
What's your opinion? I know you don't want to get into it, but is he, from what you've seen or gathered, did you put him as that type of person that could just fly off the handle?
Well, I just got asked this in my last interview, and I had to say that I couldn't really answer that question because I do feel like it goes to whether I believe he's a guilty or innocent. But I will go back to what I said earlier, and that is, even when I've interviewed someone who I know is guilty, who killed 3 people, and there was not even any question about it, Skylar DeLeon, I couldn't tell that Skylar did it either. But by the same token, Merritt's family does not believe that he's guilty. I interviewed his daughter. She said, he never hit us. I never saw any, behavior that would indicate that he was even capable of doing this. If we did anything wrong, he would just tell us to stand in the corner and think about what we did.
Right.
So it's not like he hit his kids even.
Yeah.
So, I mean, killing a kid with a sledgehammer.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Was it
your kid to go stand in the corner? Pretty different behavior. Those don't seem like they go together in the same person.
What did he get into a lot of fights? Was he in and out of prison because he was beating up people, or?
No, that's what I'm
Nothing.
saying. He was never arrested for anything violent. They were all thefts or receiving stolen property, stuff like that.
Yeah, and that see to me, unless is he or a drug user, or was he using a lot of drugs?
Nope, not that either. And he didn't pay his bills, and he would skip out, and he would, change the name of his business and move and start over and, not pay people, and would take money from people and cheat business partners and, that kind of thing. So he did have a history of that.
Kind of
but that was not
but
violent.
that's not violent.
Like I said.
That's not violent where you're killing them with the sledgehammer, That's.
And when I talked to him, like I said, I am not going to say whether he's guilty or innocent because I honestly don't know, and I'm going based on the evidence, and so that's pretty much my book. Just takes you through the decisions that were made by these investigators and why they went in certain directions and not in others, and to sort of just flesh this whole thing out and the whole confirmation bias premise. Just kind of illustrate that. I mean, there are other things, too, that I go into in the book that never got into trial, which is something I always like to do in these books, because just because things get into trial doesn't mean that's all there is. There's always a lot of stuff that never gets into the courtroom, but is still interesting from a human interest standpoint, and I'll give you a couple examples. Joseph McStay had a gun, okay? Now, it disappeared, too, and guess where it turned up? It turned up in a convicted felon's car that was stolen in Las Vegas, and it was traced back to a trade that was done with a guy who was involved in the recreational cannabis industry. Guess who Dan Kavanaugh sold the business to? 2 guys who were involved in the cannabis industry, one of whom was convicted in a big federal case where he and like 10 other people were involved in this, mailing weed in boxes across the country operation. And when he was arrested, he was found with drugs and guns and cash and drugs.
Oh.
That was pretty interesting, too. There are dots that could be connected, but nobody connected them.
Right. And so
there's nothing direct that says X so-and-so is guilty because of this. I couldn't find that. And there's a lot of weird, still unanswered questions and mysteries left in this case.
And Kavanaugh, there was really nothing about him that made the police, go further with him or arrest him or take him in? Or
he had these domestic violence convictions, but they were after the fact. So they knew about them but ignored them because they said, well, this didn't have anything to do with the McStays, and it happened after this whole case happened, therefore they're irrelevant. And he kept saying that he was going to, help the police. So they didn't even, San Bernardino County didn't even interview him until like a month before they arrested Merritt. So, that's what I'm saying. Both investigations were flawed to me. I think they left a lot of stones unturned. And in some cases, it was probably too late. Like by the time that San Bernardino got into the case, it was too late to get certain evidence because it had been 4 years, and so they went after the Merritt's truck, and they did their due diligence and found the truck, but guess what? There was no blood in it. So even though they tracked down certain evidence, it didn't support the premise that Merritt did it, that they continued to pursue him. But the search warrants, even like in the weeks before they arrested Merritt, the search warrant affidavit said we still don't have enough evidence against anybody to arrest them. And I just thought, well, okay. And I looked back into the investigative reports, and they had clearly decided that Merritt was the guy within months, and they took a year to arrest him, but they kept trying to pursue things that didn't pan out.
Yeah, yeah, that's how it is. What about Kavanaugh's last-minute confession, that sort of thing?
Well, you have to go to the credibility of the person who's claiming that, which nobody seemed to really feel like this person was credible, which is why no one called her to testify. However, it was interesting that she made that claim. And it was also interesting that the defense, he ducked the subpoena, essentially, which he admitted on TV. There was a 7-part documentary. They found him, even though apparently the defense couldn't find him. He was on the prosecution witness list, but he was never called. But he said on this documentary that he had basically avoided, testifying, that he kind of hid. So it's the straw man thing, right? It's easier to accuse somebody who's actually not in court. So did the defense really try that hard to find him? Or was it just easier to just blame him? Do you know what I mean? Right. But he claimed, I didn't kill these people. But he did threaten. He threatened other people and bragged about killing the McStays. That's the other thing that's weird. But then he says, I didn't kill McStays when he's finally on camera. Yeah. I didn't kill them. That's what I'm saying. This whole case is bizarre. It's just from start to finish.
Yeah. Yeah, it just doesn't, there's something not.
I don't know who killed him. Honestly, I don't know who killed him.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels very unsolved, or I don't know. It just doesn't feel complete.
Well, the McStay family is obviously convinced that it was Chase Merritt. They just hate him.
Right. Well, yeah.
And someone didn't like him either.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and but that's not always
Right. I know.
That's just part of I don't like him, but.
Right.
So this whole thing, how was this book for you? How was it for writing? I know what it's like writing these, but what was it like for you in this case?
Okay, so I'm going to make a couple confessions, and that is I could not get either of these families to talk to me, which I really wish was not the case. But they got put through the ringer a lot by the media. And were criticized a lot by things that they said and did along the way. I mean, for example, Michael McStay took a computer and he took some other stuff from the house right away. And then, he claimed that the detective was like, wink, wink, you can take it. But they said, we never said that. You need to bring it back. But, because we're going to search the house. And the mom started cleaning up the kitchen, which was, so basically moved evidence and cleaned up evidence of the family, how they left the house. So that was all changed by between the day that they were reported missing and the day that the search warrant was served, which was like 4 or 5 days in between, or maybe it was like 4 days, I think, it had been completely altered. And so I know she didn't do that on purpose, but I mean, she was, this all got into the paper and and they sold all the appliances out of the house, and the Summers family, I guess, didn't get any of that money because Joseph's mother said, "Oh, we're going to give all the money to Joseph's other son," even though Summer had a family too, So there were things that the McStay family did, and they got criticized for. And Michael McStay also made some comment to a reporter about, "I feel like I'm looking for, 2 crosses and graves out there, in the desert or whatever." He said something along those lines, which is in fact what happened to the bodies when they were discovered. That's where they were. And so, there were just a lot of criticism. So that, I wasn't surprised, honestly, that they didn't want to cooperate, but it would have been a better book, I think, if they had. So I used investigative reports, and I used, things that they told the detectives. I used what they said in the media because they had been interviewed previously. So, I try to write the book as fairly and sensitively as I can to the victims and their families anyway. But I just, it would have been better in their testimony. They testified in court. But again, they didn't come out of it looking that great in the testimony. The defense really attacked them as, you're basically changing what you said to the detectives to get to help the prosecution win their case. This is not what you originally said, blah, blah, blah. So I can see why they didn't want to cooperate. So that was one of the challenges. And then and then the San Diego County Sheriff's Department refused to talk to me because, they had egg on their face and they were so criticized. So I wrote a 90,000 word book. And then after really, really struggling and trying to get all these discovery materials, I finally got them with 4 months to spare. So I had a 90,000 word book, which I had written based on exhibits that I had gone and copied and reviewed. I had a court order to do that from the judge. And the interviews that I did do, with the prosecutor and the lead detective for San Bernardino and a number of other people. And all the stuff I found in the court records of, Joseph had a bankruptcy and a divorce. And, there's all kinds of stuff you can still get that's public and in the public domain. I'd written a, pretty decent book. But by the time I got this new stuff, this was just powerhouse of behind the scenes, blow by blow. This is how the investigation went. This is what they were thinking. This is what they wrote in the reports about what they were thinking, about what they found, what they were trying to find, blah, blah, blah. It turned into a much better book. So I added 60,000 words. I wrote it as fast as I could after reading thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of reports and witness interviews and what have you, and other background material. Much better book. But then I had to cut it because you can only have 100,000 word book. So I ended up having to cut 45,000 words in a month, and it still had to read well, and it still had to be accurate, and it still had to be legally vetted. And so it was a very, very challenging project based on the circumstances of how my research came together and when.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I'm still pretty proud of it. I've been getting some really great positive feedback about how I hit it out of the park, and it's so jam-packed full of research, and people are really complimenting me on the research, which, I always that's my forte. So of course I try to write it in a compelling way as well, but in this case, the research really was new and exclusive stuff that had not been released publicly before and had not been in court. And so it is really full of stuff that people haven't heard before. So I'm pretty happy with that.
Well, yeah, it's good. Or are you going to take?
It almost killed me. It almost killed me. 3 months to recover from that.
That's what I said. Are you going to take a break now, going on holiday?
Well, this was a couple of years ago. And then, then it had to go through legal vetting, which was a whole other challenge because, Dan Kavanaugh was the whole subject of the defense's case. But, and I did reach him by email and asked him if I could interview him. He didn't want to because he says, if you're not going to pay me, I'm not going to do it. It's a commercial venture and I'm not going to do it. I'm like, well, okay, I gave you your chance, But you can't, you got to be careful because he was not even ever labeled a suspect. So I have to be really careful how I wrote the whole thing too,
Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, been there, done that. Well, you still need to take a break, It's been...
Well, I did it, and then while I was waiting for the publisher, they delayed the publication date 3 times, which was very also challenging then for the promotion and marketing of the book, because every time I'd announce a new publication date, people would pre-order it, and then I'd have to say, sorry, it's delayed again. People were like, where's my book?
Yeah.
So I wrote 2.5 other novels. That's what I did.
Yeah. Yeah, that's taking a break. Write another novel.
I don't know how to take a break. I took 3 months off, and then I just got back to work.
Yeah, that's enough. I know what you mean. Yeah. Well, let's see. Let's talk about, the book comes out on the 24th of June. So everyone, that's when they get it. You can pre-order it now. And, what social media, website, how do you like people to follow you?
I'm pretty much everywhere. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Blue Sky, Threads, LinkedIn. I'm everywhere. I've got a website, CaitlinRother.com. You can contact me through there as well. And I'm also on Substack. So I've got a bunch of book talks and signings. They're on my website and also on Substack. So I hope to see people come out so I can talk about the book and sign some books.
Oh, I'm sure they will. Well, fantastic. So the book we're talking about, Down to the Bone, it's a missing family's murder and the elusive quest for justice. The author, Caitlin Rother. Thank you.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
This has been a production of the House of Mystery Radio Show. To find out more about our show, guests, or hosts, go to our website at houseofmysteryradio.com.